guys, it's Robin, RsIslandCrafts, and welcome to my craft room. This week I am working on Wonky Star Bed Runner for my daughter's new bed. She's a big girl now, she told me, and she's either purchased a double bed or a queen size bed. I can't remember which one we chose because this was back in like February or March. She decided she no longer wanted her small twin size bed that she had here at home. That since she's an adult now and living on her own, she wanted to get a big girl bed. Now, she did not call it a big girl bed, I know. But she wanted to have something with more room and feel more that fit her adult lifestyle. So she wanted to have a nice little oasis in her bedroom, a nice little calm area. So she wanted to get a larger bed. And with this getting a larger bed, she also decided she must have seen it in one of the stores we went to, or someone else had it, or a magazine or something, but she wanted to have a quilt that went just at the foot of her bed so that when she made her bed, she'd still have that nice little decoration at the bottom. And I was trying to explain to her that each day when she made her bed, which she kind of pulls everything up and sort of makes her bed, yes, but that she's not going to want to fold quilt at the bottom of her bed to make it nice and neat all the time, that they have these things called bed runners. So she's like, yes, please, would you make me a bed runner? Sure, Mama, make you anything, right? I've already made her a quilt, and it is mostly reds and blacks. Now, some of these reds that I'm using today are already in her quilt, but before her new bed was delivered, like I said months ago, we went ahead and went to Walmart and got one of those big box sets where you get the pillowcases, shams, comforter, and all that stuff, sheets. So now she couldn't get a red and black one. They didn't actually have any, but they did have a nice blue one that was on clearance that had the ombre shades that go through it. So she grabbed that. So now she has a red and black quilt that she's not willing to give up because she loves, with the cotton batting, she loves how thin it is and how lightweight it is, but yet how warm it is. Plus, Mama made it for her. She wants to keep it. So she put aside the actual blue quilt. So now she's got blue sheets and pillowcases and a red and a black quilt that she puts on her bed. So I thought I'll just go ahead and do a red, white, and blue bed runner on the bottom for her, and that'll draw the reds and the blues together, right? She's not that picky. I just need to make sure that I don't use any feminine fabric. She doesn't like florals and pastells and colors like that. So like I said, most of these reds are already in her quilt, so I know I'm fine with it. So I went ahead and I already started. I made 4 of the Wonky stars. I was going for the 6.5 inch size, but as I was making them, I'll go explain to it a little bit more later on how mine ended up being 6 inches. But I'm starting out with the 6.5. Now, if you want to make them a different size, I did go ahead and I figured out a little bit of the math for you. Basically, if you look at these, they're just 9 patches. So whatever size you would normally make a 9 patch, whether you make it 3 inches, 6 inches, 9, or 12, now those are the finished sizes. This would be a 6.5 unfinished, and then when you sew them together, they go down to 6 inches like they do normally in a quilt. So whatever sizes, whatever these numbers are here, they have to add up to 6.5. I was going to make a 12.5 inch one, but I already had all these red and blue 2.5 inch squares cut out. So I thought, why mess with it? I'll just go ahead and go with that size. But here's my little sheet. If you wanted 12.5 inch block unfinished, you'd have to cut each of these squares at 4.5 inches. A 9.5 inch block, you would cut them at 3.5. The 6.5 that we're doing today, I cut all mine at 2.5. And if you were being really brave, now I can't imagine making a large quilt with 3.5 inch squares, but it can be done. But if you wanted to do a table runner or make a small tote bag or a little zipper bag or something, and you wanted to make 3.5 inch squares, then you would need to cut your individual squares here at 1.5 inches. As I was going through and cutting up all my fabric, I had these little scrapbooking things that I purchased on sale at Michael's one time, and since there's a lot of little pieces and stuff to get lost, I put them all in there. So whenever I'm ready to work on this project, I can just pull this out and I know I have everything I need right in that container. So let me move my test blocks out of the way and I'll show you how to set up your block. Now I went ahead and put the green fabric down here because when I put this is a broadcloth, I believe it's called. When I put it down on top of my cutting board, it totally disappears and you guys can't see it really. So because I'm in love with this green fabric right now, I thought, why not? We'll just bring it right back. Now we're doing a 9 patch, and all of our outer squares are going to be our background fabric. You can choose to use white as your background fabric, or you can have a darker color. You can use a whole bunch of different creams and whites mixed together, or whatever kind of color you really choose. Now I am doing a very specific red, white, and blue block, but you could just use all of your actual star colors, can be total scraps. So nothing has to match, and as it's scrappy, everything will match. Your background colors are what's going to draw your quilt together. So if you have generally the same type of color family, it'll all work. I guess you could also do scrappy background and make your star all in creams or whites or one specific color that you could actually see that contrasted against your background fabrics, and then you'd have that reverse look. So that would be really fun too. I really like this star fabric, so I decided that I wanted to put the same fabric in the center of all my squares to kind of bring it all together. But then I didn't have enough of the star fabric. So then I also used this blue. This is the same blue that I used in my little Papa Smurf wall hanging, if you've seen it before. This is about almost what's left of it, so I decided to use these two as the centers. And I'm just going to go ahead and alternate. I think I figured out I need at least 40 blocks if she has a double bed. If she has a queen bed, I might have to use some wider sashing or something just to expand it out. And as long as the top of it's all the stars, I can go ahead and use something else on the sides if I want. Anything that's going to coordinate it all together. But as the process is going, I'll show you how I figured that out. So I'm going to have these two be the center of all of my stars. And all of the legs of my stars will be red and blue. Now I have probably twice as many red 2.5 inch squares than I do the blue. So some of them are going to be a red and blue leg, and some of them might both be red, or some of them might both be blue. I'm going to try to mix it up and maybe have at least one of the legs in each star be a double red to help expand it so I don't have too many all red stars. Now even for the legs of our stars, everything, since I'm doing a 6.5 inch block, remember, everything's going to be cut at 2.5 inches. It doesn't matter if it's my background fabric, my center, or the legs of my stars. Start them all out at 2.5 inches. But then we're going to take each of our blocks, our squares for that are part of our star, and we're going to cut them in half. Now that's going to be simple as just taking your block, your little square there for your star, whatever your star colors are going to be. And I'm going to line up corner to corner. And I'm just going to go ahead and cut that diagonal. Now if these squares are a little bit larger than 2.5, say maybe you had already had a bunch of 3-inch ones cut, or 3.5, if you don't mind trimming them down a little bit later, you can go ahead and use the larger ones if you'd like. Most of mine are 2.5, and some of them I rough cut to do when I was thinking about making a red, white, and blue hexagon project. Some of them are a little bit bigger than 2.5, but they're no bigger than 3 inches. I decided to separate mine, so I'm using two colors. I put them in two separate piles. I have a red pile and a blue pile. They're not in any specific order. Some of them are backwards, and I'm going to have to flip them over when I start sewing. That's not a problem. I just wanted to see how my piles were developing as I was going to make sure I'm kind of equaling them out. You know, basically the 2 to 1 that I think I'm going to have to do. I'm going to take you over to the machine in a second, but I want to talk to you about why my squares ended up being smaller than 6.5 inches. Now on my new machine, it does have a 1/4 inch position. You press a little button and it puts the needle right over to the 1/4 inch. And if you line it up your fabric with the side of your foot, it gives you a 1/4 inch. The seams are perfect. I've got 1/4 inch seams, no problem. But what I noticed the problem is as I was stitching, I'm going to show you how to do it in a minute, but as I was stitching my fabrics onto my background squares, it seemed that some of my background started shifting, and I ended up getting it a little bit off kilter, and some of it was a little this way and a little this way, and I think that's what made each of these legs here be not exactly 2.5 inch squares. When I pulled them out, and after I realized that my first block was a little bit off, that's when I noticed that this isn't quite the right size. So what you could do is when you're cutting the ones for here, now you could do it for all of it, when you stitch them together, like if you made your corners, if you made all of your backgrounds at 3 inches or 2 3/4, 3 inches is usually easier to do. Like when we do the half square triangles and we make them a little bit larger, like 2 7/8 instead of 2.5 inches, so that when we stitch them together and we trim them up, we have a little bit to trim. You can go ahead and cut these a 1/2 inch larger than what the pattern calls for. So mine, instead of making them at 2.5 inches, I could have made them at 3. And then these corners, the fabric would stick out past the block just a little bit here. But if I ended up losing any of my background fabric when I was making these little legs, then I could easily trim these down to 2.5 inches or trim my whole square down when I get to that point. But since I'm making them all for myself and they're all going in the same quilt and I'm not making any other blocks to go with it, I just went ahead and trimmed mine down to 6 inches. Now I may end up losing a little bit of a point here or there, so when I go ahead and I keep making my blocks, I'm going to try to make sure that none of my legs go way up to the top here, so that when I trim them down I won't lose any of those points. But since it's a wonky star, my daughter's not going to mind if she loses a little point here or there, and it's already wonky to begin with, correct? So you see how this one, all of my points are way far in from the end. So when I stitch either the sashing or the next block to it, I'm not going to lose any of these points. I actually prefer them down shorter than way out tall. But this is the reason why you make a test block first. You don't even have to use your good fabric. You can use your test fabric, some type of scraps that you have laying it down. It doesn't even have to be pretty. If it ends up being ugly, you can just toss it, or you can turn it into a pot holder or a mug rug or something like that. But test it out, cut enough for just one block. Make that block and see how it turns out. See how your stitching lines go. See where you kind of need to adjust things to make sure it comes out to the size you want. Or you can just be crazy and go for it. But I even as crazy as I am, I like to make the one test block. I made 4 for you guys today just so you could see them in a group. But I do like to I've learned my lesson. I've messed up too many fabrics where you've cut all the fabrics for your blocks, and then you go back and you found out you cut something wrong or things weren't in the right spot for the colors. So it's always really good to just take that time to make that one test block. You can use it on the back of your quilt for the label. Like I said, you can collect all your test blocks and put them together into one giant quilt, because a lot of times 4 6.5 inch blocks will make a 12.5 inch block. So depending on the size you're making, ultimately you can make a little jigsaw puzzle and put all your blocks together. Okay, enough with that. Let's get to the fun stuff. I'm going to take you over to the machine in a second, and I'm going to show you how to stitch our first leg of the star. I believe they're called star legs, right? Even though each of these blocks is turned, these are on the side, this is up and this is down, you're going to be making each of these sections exactly the same. So when I do my blocks, I always consider this the bottom and this the top, no matter whether it's on the side or it's upside down on the bottom. We're going to take our triangles and we're going to sew them right sides down to our background fabric. The one where I said that my star, that I was going to lose that point in that one star, it's because I chose to put one of the points way up there. If you put it down here, it's going to be a smaller tip for your legs of your star. But what we're going to do is we're going to be stitching along the long side of this star. So our point is going to be going that way. Because once we stitch this down, when we fold it over about 1/4 inch, it has to cover this corner here. So if we put this too far up, and maybe we put this side too far over, when we test it out to see how it's going to cover, we can see that it's not going to cover all of this white. We need to make sure that when we do our corners that it covers all of this white. Every time I put one of these triangles down, I test it. Now, I might not test it and it's an exact 1/4 inch when I'm folding it over, but I know I'm going to be coming close. So I'm going to lay it here. I'm going to fold it over, and I'm going to see that that's going to cover extra. I'm going to have extra to trim off the edge, and I know this corner of my background is completely covered. So I can angle this down a little more this way and stretch it out that way, and I'm still fine. I can bring it in and make a really small point like that. So then we're going to first sew this one, and then I'll come back and show you the next one. Now what I was doing is I was setting everything up and the sewing machine next to me, so that when I went ahead to start stitching, I can go ahead and chain piece all these blocks. We're going to get to the point of putting it all together, but I want to show you how to chain piece. Let's just do 2 blocks at the same time, okay? So we know we're going to need 2 of our center squares. So I put those down together. And then we're going to need our white squares around it. So I know I'm making 2 blocks at a time, so I'm going to put 2 here. And just make little stacks of 2 all the way around it. Once you know exactly what you're doing with your block, you could probably just set things down. But when I'm doing a 9 patch like this, I want to make sure that I have everything just right. And it doesn't hurt to just set it up ahead of time like this. So now we know we're going to be making 2 9 patches out of this. The only thing we're going to need to sew to start with is we're going to need this pile, this one, and this one. And these are going to make the legs of our star. So we're going to go ahead and have 4 of our whites. We're going to take 4 of our whites over to the sewing machine. And I'm going to take some of my blues, some of my reds, and head over to the machine. I guess I'm having one of those days because I just made all of these to show you guys. I chatted on, gave you all these tips and tricks, and I forgot to hit the record button. So we're going to do it all over again. Since they're 2.5 inch squares, it doesn't matter which is the top or bottom. Like I said, we're going to all work off of this all bottom down here. Consider that this is the bottom no matter where we are. We're going to take them right sides together, and we're going to make sure that the point of our triangle is going off to that direction, and we're going to be stitching on that long part. Now each time I do it, I was telling you guys before that when I did the math, I needed to do something like 480 times I'm going to be sewing on this line. I have to make 240 of these little squares here. As I get going, I can easily eyeball it and know whether it's going to cover the corner or not. If you go past the halfway point on either side, when I'm below that halfway point, I know when I fold it over that it's going to be fine. But if I take either of these edges and I give it more of a wonky corner and an angle like this, then I'm not going to know if it's going to cover it. So I need to check it each and every time. Because even just that little bit is going to be an issue. So I just need to make sure I just slide it down a little bit more to make sure that I'm going to cover all that background. Chain piecing just means we're going to do one right after another. It's kind of like the links in the chain. Here's one link, and we're going to put another one right after it, and it's still going to be connected. That's going to save us our thread, because every time we cut the thread, even if we were to cut it down here with the little automatic cutter, I have to pull some thread out to get started with the next one. Otherwise, you get that bird's nest of thread in the back. And that's going to, over time, that's going to add up to a lot of thread, and it's going to be a waste of thread. Plus, it's going to save you all the different motions of your body, and it's going to save you time. So if we can just keep cranking these out, because we have a lot of them to do for just, and I'm just doing a small little bed runner. If you were to do a whole entire quilt, even at a 12.5 inch block, you need to make a lot of blocks to make it worthwhile for a double or a queen size quilt. If you're just doing a table runner, then you're pretty much doing the same thing I am. A bed runner and a table runner are generally about the same size. So as I'm going through, I'm just making sure that I always have my point going off to the left there, and I make sure that I'm always going to be covering that corner. Now as I get stitched, and as I said, I know if I'm on the inside of the halfway mark there, that I know it's just going to go ahead and fit, and I don't want my corners, my little legs of my stars to be really tall. I kind of like them more short. I like the short little stubby ones. So I'm going to go ahead and keep my little triangles here. I'm going to try to keep most of them close to below the halfway point. after making about 10 or 12 of these, I kind of get that eyeball for it. But every time I come to the machine, anytime I come back, like say I take a break and work on something else, or even when I go and I iron and stuff, I still like to test them a couple times just to make sure my eye hasn't changed and that I am going to be covering up the whole area. Because it gets to be very frustrating, and if you only have just, like I only have just enough 320 of these background squares. I don't have any more of this fabric. I'm not a fan of it, so I'm not really going to be purchasing any more. This is the white broadcloth. I guess it's maybe just a step up from the muslin, but I see how see-through it is. I'm really not a fan of it. I don't like the way it feels, and I don't like how I can easily see through it. It's going to be fine for this application for what my daughter needs it for, but I really don't want to use it in an entire quilt. So make sure I have it right sides down. All in the right places. So I'm going to go ahead and just sew these last two up, and then we'll be ready to do the other side. Now this is a good project if you're doing the leader enders. You go ahead. I believe Bonnie Hunter just put out the new one for next year. And she's also did her, she's getting you, well, you guys are gathering your colors right now for your mystery quilts if you're doing it. But if you're working on one of those projects, this is a really good time to go ahead and put your leader and ender through here. Because we're going to have to take all of these out now. I'm going to separate them, and then I'm going to take them over to the iron. This is a good Netflix time, or pop in a movie. Get all your pieces ironed. I just always set my seam first by putting my hot iron down on it, and this is going to allow those stitches to go ahead and sink down into the fabric. And then I just let the tip of my iron go ahead and push it over. See if we can get a close-up of this. Okay, see how all the stitches are kind of raised up a little bit there from when we were sewing? This just go ahead and let some sink down, and they're nice and neat. And I know it wouldn't seem like much. It's really only like one thread of fabric that you're going past when you're sinking these in, if you don't go ahead and sink your stitches. But like I said, when you're doing 60 or 300 of these, that one little bit is going to add up over time, and it could make your quilt a little bit off. Now for the project we're doing today with these wonky stars, it's not really going to matter because we're doing the flip and sew here. Or the sew and flip. But the more of these you do, the more blocks you make, that little bit of the one thread, it can add up over and over exponentially through your quilt. And it could make you a little bit off. They just, all those people that are, you really know all about this stuff, they said it's a really good idea to just go ahead and set your seam. And it does seem to make it a little bit nicer. And before, when I wasn't setting the seam, sometimes I'd get that little bit of fabric here that was folded over. So when I set the seam, it just kind of presses over to the side really nicely that way. Now that we have all the first legs done, now we're just going to go ahead and stitch the second leg. I'm going to make sure that I have it to where my line's right here, so when I put my second one there, I don't want to have it up there at all. I want to make sure it's at the bottom right corner. I'm going to go ahead and make my extra red one here. I need to make two of those because we're making two stars. So I'll make sure I have two that are completely red. Now once again, I did not trim any of this excess off like sometimes you do when you're making things like this, because I want to be able to use the background fabric to square it up. When I was making my blocks, it's not adding that much bulk to it. You can trim it off at one point, I guess. When you're making a flying geese, you tend to trim this off, and you can if you want. You're just going to have to square it up in a little bit of different way. I didn't notice that much extra bulk, so I'm going to go ahead and leave mine like that. I'm going to pick my next side, make sure it's going to cover it, and I'm going to stitch it down. My second red one. Now I'm making sure when I stitch down that I go all the way to the end and start stitching, even though I'm off the block, because I don't want to make sure that I'm getting it all stitched down onto the background, because I can't see the background from here. Now when I stitch this one, since I'm trying to stitch standing up and behind the camera, I did go a little bit off to the left on my seam allowance, and that's going to be okay because I made this one, that's the way it's going to be folding over. There'll still be plenty of room. You'll be sitting down and relaxing when you do it, so you might not have that problem. I only mention it because I want to make sure that you guys, if you did see it, that it's not something I normally do. It just happened. So I'm just going to keep going through and stitching these. Then I'm only stitching one piece of fabric down at a time. Then I'm laying it right, and I know that I'm going to cover that corner. Then I'm going to cut these up, and we're going to take them over and we're going to press them. And pressing them with the two fabrics on is really no different. You're going to go ahead and just set your stitches and fold it over and get a good press. Now I've already told you guys many times that I go ahead and I do leave water in my iron, and I like a lot of steam. I just think it helps my blocks sit nice and flat. I don't do too many chain piecing, too many blocks all at once, because I do need to get up away from my sewing machine and find a, walk around the room a little bit, so I'm not stuck in that same position all the time. You really don't want, they say what, 20 minutes? After 20 minutes you should get up and move around. So however long it takes you to sew, if it's like 20 minutes for 10 blocks, and that's about all you should do, and then get up and move around. I do like to get up and move around a little bit more often than 20 minutes sometimes. Sometimes sitting for a while will bother my back. Okay, next up we're going to trim these. Because I'm doing a 6.5 inch blocks, and I really 6.5 inch ruler is like my favorite. It's not too big and it's not small like a 4 inch one or 2.5, of course. So I just kind of like this one when I'm doing smaller projects like this. Once again, I'm just lining it up, trimming on one side, trimming across the top. So all we're doing is we're using our background fabric as our guide. I'm lining it up on one side and I'm lining it up across the top. I'm just going to trim that part and sneak over and trim across the top. Then I just spin this around and I get this one little last piece that's sticking off to the side. And each one is going to be different because you put your angles differently each time. If you want, you can just trim one side, spin it around, and just keep trimming off and using... It's like when you're making, if you've ever made a string piece block, when you just trim around the paper, or any type of paper piecing, I guess. I don't do that very often. But you're just trimming along your base fabric, whatever your background happens to be. And you're using that as your guide. And trimming each one. So I'm going to finish trimming up my little stack here, and then I'm going to show you the next step. Now that I have them all trimmed up, I'm going to go ahead and bring back in my little 9.5 inch ruler that I'm using to carry my blocks with. Make sure that I have everything back to the way it was. And then I'm just going to go ahead and start putting these down where they need to be. Since I know I didn't put two of the same fabrics on any of the individual legs, then I'm not going to worry too much when I'm putting them around whether or not there's going to be two identical, because there's only, in this section, there's only one with this blue and that red. So I know on each star there's not going to be two. But as I'm going around, if I did happen to do anything weird and mix them up somehow, then I can just go ahead and check, and none of them are the same. Like I said, I don't mind if two of them are that way as long as they're not both here. Now I can just take this right over to my machine, and we're going to start stitching. We're going to stitch this column to this column, and then we're going to stitch this column to this section that we've already put together. Then we're going to go ahead and press it, and then we're going to sew each of these together. Let's take this over to the sewing machine. Now because of our block, none of these, we're not having to match any of the seams, so I can just go ahead and stitch these together without worrying about matching up seams and stuff like that. So I'll just go ahead and take my first two, my top left and center column, and I'm just going to set them down here on the table where you can't see them. Or let me put it up here for a second. And I'm just going to take the right one and put it over the left. I am going to line up the edges just like I would if I was sewing two individual 2.5 inch squares together. If your blocks are uneven like mine are going to be, I want to make sure that this is the way the star is sitting. So I want to make sure that this part going all the way across is definitely the corner that I line up. And then whatever happens on the outside of the block, won't worry about that. It's real easy to get yourself turned around. If you have to, just look again. If you want to put a little pin in it, that's okay too. Some people say pinning is bad, but sometimes people just don't like to take the time to put the pins in and take them back out. This time I'm going a little bit slower while I'm standing up and sewing because I want to make sure that I get this lined up right and I don't get a wonky seam here, because in this part of it, it's going to matter whether or not we have things lined up right. Then I just take my next two. This is the center one with our blue solids that I'm using, and then with the star coming off to the left. And I'm still going to keep always putting the right hand fabric on top of the left, so it's easier to not confuse myself and know which way my seams are. Right on the left. And then my last stack is my corner squares and the bottom part of my star. Still going right over left. Now since I'm doing a couple blocks at a time, I will have a long chain piece. And I can go ahead and use my little sunflower quilts thing to go ahead and cut them. So I know I'm not going to cut my blocks with my scissors, and I'm going nice and quick. Now what I want to do is I want to go ahead and reorientate everything to make sure that they're going in the correct direction. And by lining everything back up the way it goes, I know when I bring over my next section and start stitching it on, I'm going to have an actual star at the end, and it's not going to be some weird shape. So I know this whole top section, they all get a white square to finish off the corner. Once again, I'm still taking the right and putting it over the left. Okay, the machine had a temper tantrum, had a fit. I had to rethread the bobbin and the top thread. I think I have everything under control now. Let's see if it's going to behave. And I'm still going to keep making sure that I'm putting the right block onto the left. It's funny how any machine, even this one doesn't have that many hours put onto it, they can just have a temper tantrum whenever they feel like it. Now I'm still doing the chain piecing. I'm not stopping after each section, each row. I'm just going to continue on, and I'm not going to worry about which one I'm at, because I know I'm just going to be taking the right column and putting it over onto the left. I seem to be having one of those days. If you were paying attention, I just went ahead and put this onto this. And actually, I was supposed to stitch one of the legs on. My son had just called me while I was doing all this recording, got me off kilter, so I had to get out the seam ripper. Even that's what I get for saying I don't want to use the seam ripper, because it got me. I'm supposed to be putting these on the side of the center ones, because those white ones are my corners. It's real easy to get a little off kilter and kind of lose track of where you are. That's why I guess I should listen to myself anytime you have to pause. You should always take a second to recalculate where you are to make sure you're adding the right pieces, or your wonky star will be wonkier than you wanted. Now these pieces go like that. Now I can add my white corners. And those are done. Now I'm going to go ahead and lay these out just so you can see where we are with the block, because when I press them, I'm going to be very conscious of which way I'm pressing based on where they're located. Now, even though I didn't have to worry about these pieces and having, you know, the seam allowances match up and all that, now when I get to this point, I really want to. If I want to put a block next to it, or if I want to put sashing, I want to make sure I can easily put it together. Plus, I want the block itself to have the seams alternating so that they're not all getting in the same direction. Now, I tend to do it a certain way all the time whenever I do a 9 patch. For my center, I like both of these seams to come in. And for my top and bottom, I like to press my seams to the outside. Both of them are the same way, both the top and bottom to the outside and the center to the inside. And that's going to offset my seams, so when I go ahead and stitch these rows right here, then I can nest my seams together. I can put these together now because it's not going to matter. They're both going to get pressed the same way. press it to the inside, and then I just flip it over. And these I like to double press. I like to make sure that everything is nice and flat. When pressing to the inside, I find it's easier to do it from the back. I'm not pulling hard on this fabric, but I am giving it a little bit of attention to make sure that it's not going to fold over. Now these are going to get pressed to the outside, so I'm going to do that from the inside this time, from the right side. Just fold that seam over. Then I'm going to come over this side, and even though it got pressed a little bit when I was pressing the first one, I want to make sure that it's over nice and easy. So once again, I take this seam, press it over, spin it around, and get the other one. Then I can see that everything is laying nice and flat. Just to keep with the theme of today, where if something can go wrong, it's gonna go wrong, the storage on my phone was full, so I had to delete some things right in the middle of ironing, but you guys got the basic idea. On the top and the bottom, I went ahead and I pressed it to the outside, and in the center, I pressed it to the inside. So now when I take this over to the sewing machine, and I go to put these two together, I can go ahead and nest the seam, which just means that I'm going to line these two seams up so that they're locking together, and you can kind of wiggle and feel that they're not going to move and that they're a bit thinner right there instead of like a big clump of fabric. And then I can go ahead and stitch along that. So let's go over to the sewing machine and see if we can cause any more trouble today. Now, of course, because I took too long and I had all these problems, my phone did start losing its battery life too, so then I had to fix that too. But that was the easiest fix of the day, to just go ahead and charge the battery. So I'm going to take this top one here, make sure I have them lined up properly the way they're supposed to be. Like I said, I'm going to go ahead and nest the seams, and because we did them every other way, inside out, outside inside, outside inside, like that, these will just go ahead and sit right nice together. See if we can peek in here and see what it looks like. See how they're just going to sit right next to each other like that, so that hopefully when we open it up after sewing it, it's going to look nice and all neat, and all the seams are going to line up. But the way today is going, it's probably not going to happen. I'll do it once more with our second block. Make sure everything's lined up nice and neat. If you need to, go ahead and put your pins in right here at the intersection to hold everything together for yourself. Now I could go and press this right now, which usually makes it easier because you're pressing with only this one, two strips together, or I can go ahead and be wild and crazy and stitch this together. So I think I'm just going to go be crazy today, and we'll stitch this together. That way we can finish up all the sewing in one shot, and then we'll go finish pressing it. I said, I know we've all had days like this before, and sometimes it's best to just walk away and try something different. Maybe read a book, knit a dishcloth. But I need to get this tutorial up for you guys, so I'm just going to persevere, fight through it, and get it done. But I'm definitely going to stop at these 2 blocks and not take my chances, you know, not push my luck, do any more tonight. Back to the iron. Now here's our 2 blocks all finished. Go ahead and just still set my seams. My previous blocks, I went ahead and I pressed it out, pressed my seams to the outside, and I'm going to do that again here. So that's why sometimes, because you're dealing with this whole chunky block here, that it's easier to do it after you put the 1 row on than to come over and give it a little bit of a press. And then go back and put your last strip on. I know I'm a violent presser. We do have that extra fabric in the seams that we could trim out. And there's our 2 blocks finished. Now this is another thing with the broadcloth, because it every time I do it, no matter, even if I'm just sewing 2 of the white squares together, I get this wrinkly bit. Now I know I'm not the greatest presser in the world, and I can use some practice there. But I'm really not sure. It's got to be the fabric that's causing it. I've checked the tension on the machine and everything, and you know, it's a new machine, which doesn't necessarily mean that the tension's going to be perfect. But this is one of those things that I'm going to do a lot of quilting in the white fabric. It's going to go ahead and quilt it out. But I do prefer to use maybe a Kona cotton or something along those lines. Their fabrics are really, really nice. So there's my 2 wonky stars. You're going to see more about this later during my Whip It Wednesday as I get them together. I really hope that this tutorial worked out for you. I'm going to, like I said, I'm going to have to check it when I do the editing. I had so many interruptions and I had so many issues that came up. But that's what happens when we're in our sewing room. Things happen. You're going to have, all of a sudden, your machine's going to go crazy and you're going to have to put a new bobbin in and redo your top thread and things like that. Those are the little steps you go through to find out what the problems are. Your iron's going to run out of water. Your kids are going to come screaming. The dog is going to bark. There's always going to be a problem. You're going to need to get out your seam ripper. And if you got to push through it, you just push through it. And some days you just say, forget it, I give up, and you go work on something different. Today, I pushed through. Now my blocks aren't perfect. I'm going to go ahead and trim them up now, and we're going to see that I have to bring them down to 6 inches. Now, if everything I said was working out perfect for you, you should be able to just go ahead and put your ruler on it and maybe take a little bit off, or it'll be perfect and you won't have to worry about anything. But since I had those issues with my star legs and my wonky's really quite wonky, I'm going to go ahead and trim it down to 6 inches. What I'm going to do is I'm going to watch these star points. Now see how I kept them all pretty far from the outside, so I don't have to worry when I sew my sashing on that I'm going to lose any of my points. I'm going to have issues on that 1 block, but that's going to be okay. I just make sure that I'm going to take the 6-inch mark, and I'm going to make sure that I have a little bit of fabric sticking out past 6 inches all the way around, since I want to trim it down to 6 inches, because right now it's about 6 1/4, but I find it easier just to go down to 6, because I had a couple of my first 4 blocks that I did that were just a little bit smaller, so there's no sense trimming to 6 1/4 and then finding out later you have to trim them again. Now you can wait until you make all of your blocks, figure out your average size that you need to trim down to. Whatever your smallest block is, that's what you're going to need to trim it down to. But I'm just going to go ahead. I know 6 inches is going to be good because so far all of my blocks have been more than that. I want to make sure that when I'm looking at any of my stars that they're at least a 1/2 inch away from the edge. So sometimes I might have to move it down a little this way and move it up that way. But with this block, I can just go ahead and line this square up pretty much close to being the center, and then just trim off the edges. Then I spin it around so that I have my 2 straight edges that I just trimmed up. I have them here. And now I'm going to line it right up on that 6 inch line, just like we've trimmed many blocks in the past. I'm going to spin this because it's kind of hard for me to reach up there and do it because I've got you guys right next to me still. And I'd rather just move it around and take that extra step than make a mistake and have to make another block. Because remember, I don't have any more of this white fabric. Let me trim this one more time so you guys definitely know where we're at. This one is my tallest star leg. Well, I guess both of these are. So I'm just going to make sure that I have extra to trim off down here because my legs are so far. I do kind of want to have this be somewhat in the center, but I am going to keep in mind that I want to make sure I have at least a quarter of an inch on the side of that. And I'm just going to once again do this because it's going to be safer. Sometimes you just have to take a few extra cuts and you got to take the long way to get somewhere. Not everything can be a shortcut, right? I think these are going to look really good together. I like them just floating on the white background like this. I wish I had enough of this white fabric that I could make plenty of these. I'm going to really see what Mandy says, what size bed she has, because if I can keep these together and maybe make some wide borders, I would really like to keep it just floating on the white background like this. I really like the way it looks without any of the sashing block changing it up at all. And I don't want, like I said, I don't want to buy more of this. And I don't want to just have white fabric. I do have some other white fabric, just not enough to have made all these squares. And then you're going to have those 2 different color whites, and that's not going to work either. So this will make it nice for a lot of places in here to do some quilting. So I'm going to keep going ahead and making these. And like I said, you're going to see this in the next Whip It Wednesday. Hopefully I might have enough of my stars. Right now I have cut enough of this fabric to make 40 of these. And then I'm going to have to figure out a layout. That's what, when I'm making a project like this and I don't have an actual pattern, I may know how to make a square, but I don't know what the layout and everything is, and I just kind of making it as I go. I really enjoy that process. It's a lot of creativity there that you can just keep changing things and adding things until it gets to where you want it to be. Oh, look, and I even put it so that my blue centers are different. That is a good thing for today. For all those little hiccups in the road there, it was really nice to have something that just worked out that way, even though I'm not actually sewing it together. So I hope that was understandable and you guys could figure out how to do this. Once again, if you have any questions, just leave them down below in the comments. If I need to make another small video, I'll go ahead, or I'll just answer you down there in the comments. See you later. Bye.